Item, as always, is roll call, and we'll do that by introductions. I'm Jordan Hess with City Council.
Sarah Cofield with Health Department, proxy for Debbie Johnston.
Dudley Improda, Planning Board.
John Engen, Mayor of the City of Missoula.
Chris Lonsbury, Chief Operating Officer for the County of Missoula.
Don MacArthur, Missoula Urban Transportation District.
Aaron Wilson with the City of Missoula and MPO.
Bert, you want to introduce yourself? Excellent. Okay, we have minutes from October 4th. I'd entertain a motion to approve or amend those. Is there a second? Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any discussion? Any public comment? Okay, all those in favor of approving the minutes, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. Any public comment on items not on our agenda? All right. We have three new business agenda items. We're going to skip over the first one. Aaron, do you want to touch on that briefly, the Missoula in Motion strategic plan?
Yeah, we were going to do some informational presentation on that, but Catherine was going to do that presentation. She was out of town during TTAC, and so we postponed the presentation then, and we thought because this is a holiday week, it's probably another good time to just postpone that fully to December. So we'll come back next month with that presentation. But we did attach the strategic plan to the agenda, so if you want to read it ahead of time, that would be great.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. Our second item is to review and approve proposed amendment number 1 to the fiscal year 2019 Unified Planning Work Program.
Yeah, thanks. So there's a number of amendments that we have in this proposed, the Amendment 1 to the UPWP for a number of projects that we received requests for or have been planning since we adopted that. It's only been a couple of months, but just the nature of how these things came about, we're doing them as an amendment. So there's 4 items I'll talk quickly about. One is providing $50,000 of PL funds to support the downtown master plan update. Then we have inclusion of $75,000 for doing pavement condition assessment for the urban area. That would be to replace funding that was not approved by City Council for the city, but also allows us to do pavement assessment or pavement condition assessments for areas outside of city limits, but within the MPO area. And then we have $25,000 requested to put towards purchase of additional temporary eco counters. These are the bike ped counters that we've been installing on our trail system, but are mobile, so we can deploy them temporarily in locations throughout the city and give us more flexibility in our count program, but also more accurate results than we're getting currently. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the final item is increasing staff by 0.4 FTE towards an administrative assistant. So this is currently our administrative funds are going partially towards the program assistant that is split between Missoula in Motion and the MPO, and that person supports both programs. Based on some of the work we've done with the strategic plan, and Catherine will present next month, and why we had hoped to do it this month as part of, at the same time as this request, the greater need from Missoula in Motion for staff time over resources. So making that program assistant a full-time Missoula in Motion position, and then this additional funding would essentially allow us to hire a full-time administrative assistant for the transportation division to cover that additional time. That will free up staff time. We've been doing a lot more work in-house on our planning documents. We also have more plans that are going to require updating in the future. So having that additional admin support for the division and the MPO will allow that person to take on some of the routine admin tasks, such as updating the website, doing the social media, helping us with meetings, other administrative tasks, and allow our planning staff to focus more on plan updates and related activities. So I can add a little bit more detail on those. The downtown master plan, this request came in a couple months ago. There's quite a bit of transportation planning need in the downtown. It's certainly one of our largest regional transportation impacts in terms of people going to and around downtown. There's also a number of significant projects going on right now that are, I think, warrant some additional planning and thinking about how transportation works within the downtown. Examples are the Higgins Street Bridge reconstruction that is going to start next summer or next fall, looking at the front main conversion and ensuring that project, sort of ironing out the details on how that's going to impact transportation in the region. Other big projects such as the Riverfront Triangle redevelopment, thinking about neighborhood connectivity into and around downtown, how are non-motorized trips in particular accessing downtown and how can we better facilitate that, and just looking kind of big picture at how we integrate the land use and transportation. So I think that's a really worthwhile project to get the transportation right, and having the PL funds helps ensure that we can do that. For the pavement condition, there's not too much else to say about that, other than it will be really helpful getting that done this summer. It helps us spend down our PL funds so they're not subject to a rescission, and it will help us have better data going into the next long-range plan update and thinking about how we prioritize new projects versus maintenance of our existing facilities and what is the relative need for each of those. So that data will be really helpful. It also has the ancillary benefit of helping the city and perhaps the county with thinking about prioritizing where those maintenance funds are best utilized and how can we work with other infrastructure plans that we have for utilities and combine these projects and get a little bit better efficiency in how we're working within the right-of-way. And then the eco counters, this is just supporting our ongoing program, non-motorized count program. The temporary counters have the added benefit that we can do longer duration counts than our current 2-hour volunteer. We can do it similar to how we do our motorized vehicle counts, where we have stations around the city. We count those for 48 or 72 hours and then move the counter the next week or the next, we can do multiple locations each week, and we can start getting a much more accurate estimate of non-motorized trips. We also can use these for pre and post project counts. So looking at projects like future trails or non-motorized facilities, all around the region, and measure the impact that those projects will have. A good example would be neighborhood greenways. We anticipate that if we can start implementing those particular facilities, that we will see more cyclists using those neighborhood routes and the crossings, and these counters will allow us to actually measure that. And then when we go to look for additional funding, we will have a good idea of what that impact is. And then I kind of went over the staffing need. Again, this just allows us to have more capacity within the MPO to do the work that we've been doing over the last several years, and allows Missoula in Motion to expand some of their programs by making that program assistant full-time. So that's kind of the overview of those requests. I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Thanks, Aaron. Mayor?
Aaron, what's our FTE count in Missoula in Motion today?
Currently, it's 2.5, but we also have been running, I think, a full FTE vacancy for a number of years now, partially to save some money, be a little bit more efficient, but with the shift in priority through the strategic plan to a more labor-intensive activities such as individualized marketing. That's like, we're going to probably need more people than money. So we don't anticipate increasing our budget at all. It would just increase the staff resources that we're funding.
So you'd have net 3 then?
Yeah, we'd have a total of 3. So we'd be going from about 2.5 to 3 actually hired. But again, we've been running that vacancy for a couple of years now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Additional questions? Or discussion or motion on this item?
I'd be happy to move the amendment.
Thank you, Mayor Engen. And is there a second? Second. Thank you. And any public comment on the item? Okay. So all those in favor of the amendment, please say aye.
Aye.
And opposed, no? Motion passes. And we'll move on to our final agenda item, which is presentation on the Community Transportation Safety Plan update.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm going to sit in for Dave today. He's out sick, so I'm going to walk through some. We wanted to give essentially an update on the CTSP process. We're hoping to give these updates periodically throughout the planning process. We also have a public meeting coming up next week on Tuesday at 5:30 here in council chambers. So this is an opportunity for us to kind of present some of the data that we've been working with to TPCC ahead of that public meeting and sort of let you know where we're at and what the data is starting to show. Because I think we've done a lot of work analyzing crash data over the last couple of months, and so I'm not going to go over all of the charts and graphs there. It's pretty information dense looking through all of those infographics, but just look at some of the highlights. So on the first page, one of the first things we did was just look at what are the most common types of crashes or where they're occurring. And so this first chart is showing two things. One is the total number of crashes involved in each of these potential, or these emphasis areas, such as intersection crashes or inattentive drivers. So the line chart on here with the line and dot, those are total crashes. The bars on here are severe crashes and fatalities. So you can get a sense, this shows us not only what is contributing the most or most commonly involved in crashes, but also what is the relative severity rate. So you can look at intersection crashes are by far the most common. A lot of these other emphasis areas may also occur at intersections, which can be contributing to that high number. But we know that intersections are problematic for crashes. Other things that we can see are, for example, with non-motorized transportation are relatively uncommon in terms of the number of crashes, but they are much more likely to be severe or fatal. So plotting these out allows us to kind of look through, see what are the most common types of crashes, what are particularly more likely to be severe, and start to suss out what our emphasis areas might be in the safety plan. So based on this, we've kind of outlined the top 5 emphasis areas.
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Aaron, before we leave that slide,
Yeah.
total crashes, what's the geographic region?
Oh, yeah, sorry. So this is for the planning area for the MPO. So this includes city limits and the urbanized area around Missoula. And I have some maps that I'll show too that kind of show the extent of where crashes are occurring. But it is city and urbanized portions of the county.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Could I ask one other question
Yeah,
too? Do they, if somebody was impaired and had a crash at an intersection, does that appear in both?
Yes. Yep. Yeah, so there's a lot of overlap in these emphasis areas, but it allows us to start to look at, where are the most common locations or causes of crashes, and then start to dive deeper into those. And I'll kind of go over some of those as we go through this a little bit in terms of those overlapping causes. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thanks. Sorry, just one other quick question. I just want to make sure I'm understanding both the bar and the line. There's no actual correlation between the gap between the bar and the line.
No, consider those.
So it's,
yeah.
okay.
Just total numbers, but it does allow us to see, like using non-motorized crashes, because this is something that I'll touch on again, being fairly uncommon in terms of the overall number of crashes. There's only 464 reported non-motorized crashes, which ranks something like 7th or 8th in terms of the total number. But there were over 80 severe or fatal crashes, which is 4th or 5th in terms of the number of severe crashes. So you can kind of see that relationship of how many crashes versus how severe those crashes are. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm just worried that from a public standpoint, where there isn't a relation there, it makes it seem like the one, looking at your top 1 intersection crashes, there's 191 that were serious injury, 9 that were severe injury or fatalities, and then a small gap for 5,160 crashes.
Sure, yeah.
Yet when you get down to non-motorized that you were just talking about, that green line comes into into that bar, and so it creates a kind of disproportional relationship between those.
Yeah, no, definitely.
So.
It is a little bit, requires a little bit of interpretation, and one of the issues I think we're finding with all this is we have almost too much. I don't think we have too much data, but the more data you have, the harder it is to parse that out in meaningful ways without leaving something critical out, but also showing things that are useful. So it's helpful feedback, and we'll definitely think about ways that we can convey that a little bit clearer. So I want to point out just the top 5 emphasis areas based on number of crashes and severity rate. So looking at total number of crashes, as I mentioned, intersection crashes were the most common contributing factor or factor related to crashes, followed by inattentive drivers, young drivers, older drivers, and speed-related causes to a crash. However, when you look at severity, so these are severe injuries or fatalities, non-motorized crashes are much more likely to be severe than any other type of crash, or more likely to be severe. Yeah, Dudley, did you have?
But all these crashes were obviously serious enough to get reported.
Yeah.
So you're not getting every non-motorist crash.
No.
Obviously, you're not getting every deer that's hit.
Right, just looking at.
So just to make that point,
Yeah.
all of these had to be serious enough to get the information.
Yeah, so this is just looking at those severe crashes, as opposed to, over here, intersection crashes being 46% of all crashes, whether it's property damage, injury, severe, or fatal. If we just look at those severe crashes that essentially had a severe injury, which I believe is someone being taken to the hospital or being hospitalized to some extent. So non-motorized, again, have few crashes, high severity for those crashes, followed by motorcyclists, drowsy drivers. Unrestrained occupants is another one where drivers or occupants who are unrestrained and involved in a crash are more likely to be injured. And then vehicles that are run off the road, whether that's from inattentive, drowsy, again, there's some overlap in some of these emphasis areas. Does that make sense before I move on? So we also looked at some general trends. This is data that you all have likely seen before when we talk about our performance measures, but it's something that we want to include in the safety plan update, is looking at those federally required performance measures and how we're doing locally and how we might be supporting the state goals that we said we would support in adoption of those performance measures, if you'll remember back 6 or 7 months. So looking at fatalities, generally it's a decrease, but we have seen an uptick in the last couple of years. Fatalities tend to be fairly rare in terms of overall crashes, so it's hard to say if that's a definite trend or if it's just sort of variation from year to year. But in terms of serious injuries, we are seeing a definitive decline year to year. That decline is slowing a little bit, but I think some of that maybe we're getting down to those serious crashes that are just harder to prevent. The fewer crashes you get, the harder it is to prevent those last few, I think. Or we're doing a good job and continue to reduce those crashes, so it's good to see. Non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries are also decreasing throughout the region, so another good trend that I think shows we're making progress. I'm not going to go into all of the detail on each one of these emphasis areas because there's just a lot of data there and it's worth looking through, and we're happy to answer any questions at any time about this data. But starting to break down, looking at each type of crash. So intersection crashes, we can look at specific locations and the type of signal control that are at those intersections. We can look at the locations. Are they on principal arterial streets, local streets? We can look at the type of crashes that happen within intersections. So if we're looking to prevent intersection-related crashes, looking at the top causes within an intersection is useful for accomplishing that. So again, breaking it down by all types of crashes and then just looking at severe crashes, and we can see some of the same trends like right angle, rear end, and then those non-motorized bicycle and pedestrian crashes are generally overrepresented in terms of severity at intersections. And then we have a variety of other metrics in terms of times of day, overlapping causes of crashes. So helpful information. Inattentive drivers, similar, looking at a lot of different factors related to that. I don't know if there's much of note here other than pointing out that it's not always reported whether or not a driver was inattentive. So it's one limitation that we know, that it's often difficult to determine if a driver was distracted when they were involved in a crash. But of those distractions that were reported, 48% of the distractions were from a passenger. So we always think of cell phone as being the predominant distraction in a car, but something like a passenger could be just as or more distracting. So again, helpful for developing strategies to prevent these types of crashes is communicating effectively what is it that is a distraction and how can those lead to crashes. So sometimes the data can support our perceptions, and sometimes it can add some additional context to how we communicate about these things. Non-motorist involved crashes, this is, as I mentioned, more likely to be severe than other types of crashes. So one of the statistics I'll point out from the data is that non-motorized crashes are only 4% of all crashes that we have recorded, but are 21% of severe crashes. So again, it makes sense that bicyclists and pedestrians have less protection than someone who is in a motor vehicle. There's plenty of technology out there that increases the safety of somebody who is in a vehicle, but not a lot out there that protects someone who is outside of that vehicle. So it sort of makes sense, but I think it encourages us to try to prevent those crashes from happening so that we don't have the severity coming out of that particular mode. Also interesting, the gender of non-motorists involved in crashes seems to be skewed towards male pedestrians or cyclists. However, we know that cyclists tend to be about 2/3 male, 1/3 female, so this number follows that pretty closely, at least for the cyclists. Not sure if that is driven predominantly by pedestrians or cyclists, but we know that there is some mode choice impact on that gender split. So I think it generally makes sense. Impaired drivers, it's interesting to note that of drivers involved in a crash, 4.6% were impaired. We also had that number for non-motorists, so 4.4% of all cyclists were impaired and 5.5% of all pedestrians were impaired. So pretty close numbers there, that generally if someone was impaired, it's not any higher for pedestrians, bicyclists, or drivers. But also interesting that impaired drivers were 66% male. I don't know what that says necessarily about impaired driving, but it's something that we should pay attention to, that there is a fairly big difference there. And just looking at the number of fatalities, that 8 impaired drivers were killed over the past 5 years, 2 sober drivers, 4 passengers, and 2 non-motorists. So there's definitely a lot of fatalities involved with impaired driving. Unrestrained occupants is another emphasis area that we know is an issue. It's another one of those where we have only 8% of all crashes involved an unrestrained occupant, but 21% of severe crashes. So again, if you're unrestrained and involved in a crash, you're more likely to be severely injured or killed. Another interesting point on the unrestrained occupants is the high percentage of youth 18 and under who are unrestrained. And when we say unrestrained, that means completely unrestrained or improperly restrained. So say using the lap belt but not the shoulder restraint. So could be completely unrestrained or improperly. Not too much to say about run off the road crashes, other than we can look at again these contributing factors, such as where inattentive reckless driving is causing a very high percentage of those run off the road crashes. So again, we can start to look at where these emphasis areas overlap and think about strategies to address multiple emphasis areas with those strategies. And then we started to look at younger drivers and older drivers, just knowing that they are disproportionately represented in our crash data. And so looking at what are the causes of those particular crashes, looking at, who is at fault versus who is involved, and, looking at those other factors that might be contributing and seeing if there's a trend that we can work on addressing, whether it's through education or enforcement or other strategies. And then large trucks and motorcycles, again, these are emphasis areas that we can look at. Don't have too much to say about that here, but it's worth looking through the data and seeing what it's telling us about what's contributing to those crashes. So that's what we have for the data. I also want to show we've started mapping the crashes. Some of this needs to be caveated in that we haven't gotten to crash rates yet in our maps, but it's something that we're working on. But this gives you a sense of where all the crashes are occurring geographically. So predominantly, most of these crashes are within the city. And then again, almost all of them are within the urbanized area. But we can start looking at some of these crash densities to look at specific locations within the city, not just are they at intersections, but which intersections are contributing to that. And this is where crash rates are going to be really critical to really tell us the full story about what's going on, because you'll see in terms of raw numbers, Reserve and Mullen has a really high concentration of crashes, but it is also our most highly traveled intersection in the city. And so that may be just a factor of more people going through that intersection, more crashes. It may not be as much of a problem as some of these other intersections that have potentially higher crashes per trip entering that. So that's something that we're working on currently to get that added level of detail to help address where are there significant issues that we can address. And then looking at things like where are run-off the road crashes happening, and seeing orange spots like the bend in Highway 93 coming in from Lolo that we know is a problem. And then we can start looking at those locations, identify what the appropriate treatment might be, and thinking about how we can address each specific cause. And we've done the same for, again, intersections, non-motorized crashes. This is one where it'll be really challenging to get rates because we don't have very good detailed non-motorized counts like we do for motor vehicles. So this is kind of going back to the UPWP amendment. Getting those temporary counters will be really helpful for in future updates, being able to calculate rates, hopefully, or getting closer to being able to. So I think that's all I have for this. It's a lot of data. I would encourage you to look through it. If you have any questions, sometimes interpreting those charts can be a little bit of a chore. But if you have questions, get in touch, or I'm happy to answer anything now if there are questions or concerns, or if folks can publicize our public meeting that's next Tuesday. We'll be taking some general perceptions about safety, reviewing some of this data, not this full set of data, but a simplified, sort of more understandable or easily digestible set of that. And then we have a survey out asking for perceptions about safety so we can see how the community perceptions match or don't match with the data and whether we need to do some work there. Any questions?
Mary, or Dudley, go ahead.
Well, it'd just be interesting to me, and if you had circles in there compared to, and I know there's fewer of them, so you're going to have fewer crashes, but the percentage.
Oh,
I mean, my expectation would be they were a little safer, but.
At roundabouts?
Yeah.
I mean, that's something we sort of have tracked over time when we look at that occasionally, but we do have I think we're starting to get some good pre and post crash data for those. Yeah, definitely.
Mayor, did you have something?
Aaron, could you just give me a quick reminder of your schedule for wrapping up plan?
Wrapping up the plan? Yeah, so I think the plan is to have it written and out, the draft plan out in the spring sometime, so March, and then hopefully having it adopted by April or May.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm curious to give some examples of other intersections, since it seems to be a fairly high percentage of the crashes.
Yeah, that was something we talked about at our committee meeting and talked with the law enforcement folks and I think that those are likely intersections that have no traffic control, that it's something that is left blank in. So let me go back to that.
I guess I'm curious because you already have a category for uncontrolled.
Yeah, and this is where, sometimes digging through the data, sometimes they will report it as an uncontrolled intersection, and sometimes that category will just be left blank because they didn't report any there. So it could be reported as uncontrolled or not reported. Both of those are likely uncontrolled intersections, but we don't know for sure. So that's something that we're trying to get a better handle of from talking to law enforcement and the folks who are reporting these crashes. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? What was the biggest, oftentimes when you look at data, or this is quite a wealth of data, and I think this will be incredibly useful. Oftentimes, there are a lot of things that aren't very surprising and maybe a couple of things that are surprising. What were the couple of surprises in this?
That's a good question. I think just the rate of the difference between the number of crashes and the severity for non-motorized, maybe that's not really surprising, but to see it on paper that 4% of crashes, but a fifth of all severe crashes is, I think concerning that when someone is involved in a crash as a pedestrian or bicyclist, that it is likely to be severe or more likely to be severe. I think what else was I think the uptick in fatalities is something that we were interested in monitoring a little bit closer, that, we've seen a pretty consistent decrease or level rate of fatalities for a number of years now. So understanding why that is occurring, whether it's, again, just variability from year to year that, there are so few, but hopefully we can continue that downward trend on the fatalities. And then, just the extent to which I think younger and older drivers are involved in crashes might be something that's worth looking at more in this safety plan. Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot more there that once we dive into it and really spend some time discussing what our emphasis areas will be, we'll come up with some more helpful.
Sarah?
So on that subject of changing fatality numbers and whatnot, what factors do you contribute to the decrease that we saw? Is there any active work being done to address crashes to reduce fatalities, or is it just something that happened?
I suspect I think some of it is safety improvements that we have made over the year. The national studies show that roundabouts, for example, don't necessarily decrease the overall rate of crashes, but they do decrease the severity by eliminating just the number of conflict points in an intersection and eliminating some of the crash types that are more likely to be serious or fatal, like T-bone crashes or head-on. So I think there's some that's related to those kinds of improvements. And I think that relates to non-motorized crashes as well, that we've done a lot in the last 5 to 10 years to really increase bicycle and pedestrian safety in our facilities. I suspect some of the improvement is also due to vehicle technology, so airbags, things that just increase the safety of occupants. And more we're seeing technology that I think will start to protect people outside of the vehicle as well, such as detection, vehicle-to-vehicle technology. There's a whole host of new and developing things that will hopefully transfer that technology gain to people outside of the vehicle, which is encouraging. And then I think there's also been some improvement in emergency care. Just trauma care has gotten better over the years. So if you are involved in a severe crash, hopefully you're less likely to die as a result of that. Yeah.
Looks like, Bert, you had something to... Can you come up so you're on the record, on the microphone?
Bert Caldwell from Bonner. Just a quick question on distracted drivers. Have you gotten any kind of a correlation between the time that The city implemented no phone usage in a car, and now. Have you got the kind of data to do that?
I'm not sure. I don't know that we've actually looked at those dates, but that's something that we could certainly do. I'm trying to remember does anyone remember when that ordinance was adopted?
It was prior to my council service, so it was before January of 2014.
Yeah, our data goes back to 2007, so I suspect we may have some data from prior to that ordinance and something we can look at for sure. Yeah, it's a good thought.
I still see a lot of it, but it's a lot less than it used to be. So
Yeah.
it was a question.
Yeah, thank you.
That's a good topic. Any other public comment or questions? Okay. Anything else from the committee? All right. Thank you, Aaron. Appreciate the update on that.
Sure, no problem.
Our last item is just announcements and closing comments. Anyone have anything else to add? All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll be adjourned.